This week at the French Open, Canadian tennis star Eugenie Bouchard revealed that she had fought a personal battle off the court.
Yeah, it's definitely a struggle I went through in 2015. I felt a lot of pressure and kind of this expectation that if you win a match, it's normal. If you lose, it's a disaster. So, before matches, I was very nervous and definitely had trouble eating because, I just felt like it would come right back up. So it's a difficulty I went through, not just before matches, but, happened to me at other meals as well. So, people think I was concerned about my body image and things like that, and I was losing weight on purpose, but that was really not the case. And I was also just so stressed, I think, like I was just kind of burning calories, even though, more than I normally would. And so it was really hard to kind of intake enough to kind of keep my weight up or even gain weight, which was the goal, to become stronger. So, yeah, it's something I went through, but I feel like I learned from it, and I know now that even if I feel sick, I have to force food down my throat. And yeah, I feel like I've come out stronger and, able to deal with a problem if it ever comes back to me again.
Did you see any specialists or change?
So athletes are at a higher risk of eating disorders, especially female athletes. Joining me now is Dr. Joelene Huber. She's a pediatrician professor of medicine at the University of Toronto. Dr. Huber is here to speak to us about this issue. Now, let's define our terms here. We talk about eating disorders and what Eugenie Bouchard is talking about. There's a wide spectrum there, isn't it, of people not eating nutritiously and keeping the weight on.
Exactly. So traditionally there's eating disorders, which we define as things like anorexia nervosa, which is under-eating, a distorted body image, and under-eating to maintain an unhealthy weight. And there's a whole mental health aspect to that in terms of a distorted body image. Then there's bulimia nervosa, which is binging, so going through periods of overeating and binging and then purging in some way to get, whether it's induced vomiting, using laxatives, excessive exercise. And there's also some distorted body image and abnormal relationships with food. And then there's binge eating disorder. And those are traditionally called eating disorders, and there's strict criteria for diagnosis. But there's also disordered eating, and that's just any abnormal eating. And sometimes that's a precursor to an eating disorder, but those can be more common in athletes. And there's one study of college female athletes showing that up to 30% have these patterns of disordered eating that can lead to eating disorders or place them at risk for eating disorder, but are not specifically an eating disorder.
So why are female athletes susceptible to this full spectrum, arguably, of not eating right?
Yeah, so we talk a lot about making sure that we get kids physically active and how great sports are, and they really are good for building self-esteem and team building and self-confidence. But the pressures of competition and sports and just social pressures can be quite high on females. In the Clinical Journal of Sports Medicine, a study out of Norway looked at elite athletes compared to the general population, and they showed that there's a higher incidence of eating disorders, and particularly among female athletes, and then again a higher incidence of just that disordered eating among female athletes. I think there's a whole bunch of, we don't know what causes eating disorders or disordered eating, but there's social pressures, the stresses that Eugenie talked about. There's a lot of stresses when it comes to competitions. They're higher in those lean and weight-dependent sports, so sports where you have an aesthetic like figure skating or gymnastics. Also, they can be higher in single sports. So Eugenie the pressure is all on her as a tennis player or a swimmer or a diver. All those kind of sports can place a lot of pressure, particularly on women.
We've talked about the pressure on dancers, too, for example, as well, to maintain that body image.
Yeah, and a lot of these sports, there's pressure on them to get sponsors and to look a certain way, and then just the stress of it all combined it's always a multifactorial issue. We all know when we're stressed, we either eat more or we eat less, and that's all disordered eating.
I guess the most dramatic example would be as opposed to a male football player who just packs on the pounds and the beer and the burgers.
Right, or even, and that can be binge eating. You can also be a binge eater as well that's disordered eating.
Yeah, so what are some of the warning signs to watch for parents and athletes themselves?
Yeah, so again, this can happen to anybody, not just athletes. It can happen to boys, girls, teens, really emerge at any age. So it's important to watch for some of the behavioral signs. So skipping out on meals, avoiding meals, restricting food, and we'll just
There we go.
wait for
No,
the
we're
next
just watching
one.
them come up here. Yep, there you go.
So worry or preoccupation about body image is a big thing. If you hear people talking about that, that's a concern. Excessive exercise, we know, is another way that people are compensating to try to lose that weight when they have a distorted body image. Use of laxatives for weight loss is a dangerous sign. So if you notice that, those are all things to watch for. From more of a physical perspective, if you notice somebody to be or going to the bathroom after meals, they can be maybe using laxatives or going to vomit or induce vomiting. If you notice that, that's also a warning sign to watch for, and being more irritable and withdrawn. Physically, if you're seeing weight loss, but it's not always weight loss, but if they're not gaining weight or there's weight loss, if they're cold, low energy, sometimes vital signs are affected, so they can be more dizzy. So those are all really important physical things to watch for and help people to seek treatment.
But as you say, it's a combined, it's the physical and it's the mental kind of working together, and that's so important for athletes at every stage, and now, of course, we're seeing it here. So what are, for example, if we're looking at treatment and the signs, how do we deal with this?
Right, so exactly. So I would say as a coach or as a parent or even you yourself are worried about maybe having an eating disorder, a lot of people are try to cover it up. So it's not something that people tend to talk about. So if you notice some of these signs, encourage somebody to seek help by going to a doctor. A doctor will help to refer somebody to a place where they can have a full treatment that's both physical, medical, as well as psychological, and seek counseling to help really support them through this. As just individuals in society, as parents and coaches, we can be role models. So I really encourage people to avoid negative talk about their own body appearance, particularly around teens and children, talking about I need to lose weight or not being happy with your own appearance. That sends a strong and powerful message to kids. We all need to be careful of that. We also need to just talk about healthy eating rather than focusing on good foods, bad foods, or eating clean. Being healthy in our role modeling is really important as well.
At the risk of bad pun, there's a lot to digest there.
Yes.
For sure. Dr. Huber, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Joelene Huber is a pediatrician and professor of medicine at the University of Toronto.